Top U.S. and Chinese officials clash in their first in-person meeting. The Chinese side responded to American comments on human rights violations with a 15-minute monologue. Chinese propaganda outlets report on the fiery exchanges, but tell a different story than the rest of the world. The Chinese regime is blaming the U.S. government for alleged anti-Asian crimes, but a China analyst says it's actually the CCP's fault. The Biden administration subpoenaed a number of Chinese companies. The move aims to probe for information about possible national security risks. And students from one Chinese university flee their campus en masse. That's after enduring harsh lockdown measures since last semester. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Top U.S. and Chinese officials clashed in their first in-person meeting under the Biden administration yesterday. The U.S. says it's looking for China to change its behavior if China wants to restore an agreeable relationship.
Top diplomats from the United States and China sparred in a rare extended back-and-forth showdown on public display. Secretary of State Antony Blinken brought up several highly anticipated points on China's threat to democracy and human rights, among others.
Our deep concerns with actions by China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion toward our allies. Each of these actions threaten the rules-based order that maintains global stability.
Blinken said the alternative to a rules-based order is a scenario where might makes right and winners take all. And he said that would be a far more violent and unstable world for everyone. The night before the meeting, Beijing set its tone, saying the U.S. is basically delusional if it thinks the Chinese Communist Party will compromise. Chinese top diplomat Yang Jiechi fired back, accusing the U.S. of treating its minorities poorly, saying its democracy is struggling and criticizing its foreign trade policies. Yang also referenced Biden's phone call with Chinese leader Xi Jinping, in which the leader of the free world said the two of them need not have a conflict. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the U.S. does not want conflict with China, but it will stand up for its friends and principles.
We'll make clear today that our overriding priority on the United States' side is to ensure that our approach in the world and our approach to China benefits the American people and protects the interests of our allies and partners. We do not seek conflict, but we welcome stiff competition.
Yang propped China up and laid out economic goals.
By the year 2035, China will surely achieve basic modernization, and by the year 2050, China will achieve full modernization.
Sullivan told reporters after the meeting that it seems China basically came to Alaska to put on a show and attract favorable attention to themselves. The two sides appear set to agree on very little during the talks that are expected to continue on Friday.
The first high-level talk between China and the U.S. is wrapping up on Friday. But besides its fiery exchanges, the meeting also came with an unexpected outburst. NTD's Juliet Song has more on that.
Well, good afternoon.
Top U.S. diplomat Antony Blinken opened the Friday meeting with a 2-minute talk. He said the U.S. would discuss concerns over China's human rights abuses and military aggression.
Our intent is to be direct about our concerns, direct about our priorities, with the goal of a more clear-eyed relationship between our countries moving forward. Thank you for being here.
But top Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi fired back with an over 15-minute-long monologue in Chinese. Yang accused the U.S. of having a Cold War mentality and labeled U.S. criticism over China's actions in Xinjiang and Hong Kong as interfering with China's internal affairs. The translator later relayed Yang's speech in English. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi followed with another 4-minute speech. The U.S. diplomats responded with a brief rebuttal. The U.S. delegation later accused Chinese officials of breaking diplomatic protocols. A Biden administration official told reporters that the two sides agreed to a 2-minute speech beforehand, but that China violated the rules. The official, who asked not to be identified, said the Chinese diplomats seemed to have arrived intent on grandstanding, focused on public theatrics and dramatics over substance. The official also adds that the fiery response from the Chinese side looked like a show for its domestic audience. Back home, the Chinese Communist Party's media mouthpiece is telling a different story. State broadcaster China Central Television accused the U.S. of going way overtime during opening remarks and said the U.S. launched a groundless attack on China's domestic and foreign policy. Most Chinese citizens can only access news from state-controlled sources because of internet censorship. That's unless they can break through Beijing's censorship firewall using a special software. Because of the Chinese media's angle, many internet users applauded the Chinese diplomats. One user said, it was ridiculous of the U.S. said to be so rude. But another user pushed back against the Chinese-sized media coverage, saying the U.S. only talked for about 2 minutes, while Yang Jiechi talked for over 10 minutes. So who went overtime? The user also dared Chinese media outlets to live stream the full, unedited meeting for Chinese citizens. Juliet Song, NTD News.
The Chinese regime is blaming the U.S. government for alleged anti-Asian crimes. But a China analyst says the attacks are actually the Chinese regime's fault. NTD's Penny Zhou has more.
The recent shooting in Atlanta has caused heated discussion over alleged anti-Asian discriminations. A man killed 8 people, including 6 Asian women. The suspect denied racial motivation for the attacks, but local police say they are still investigating. When asked about crimes targeting Asian Americans, the Chinese regime's foreign ministry responded on Thursday.
These ugly discriminations are outrageous and distressing.
He then blamed the Trump administration, saying they fanned racism and hatred against the Chinese. Some in the U.S. also argued that U.S. conflicts with the Chinese regime are partially to blame for the racial backlash. But China affairs commentator Tang Jingyuan says there is a logical fallacy in this argument. The Chinese regime is trying to conflate the Communist Party with the Chinese people.
The Communist Party is the one who caused the pandemic. It covered up the outbreak and then allowed it to spread. This has nothing to do with the Asian and Chinese Americans living in other countries.
In early January of last year, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, censored news about the CCP virus outbreak, punished whistleblowers, and destroyed virus samples. It banned Chinese citizens from traveling within the nation, but allowed them to fly internationally.
Asian or Chinese in the United States are also infected by the virus, and some have died. They are all victims of the CCP's cover-up.
He says the regime is actually partially to blame for anti-Asian sentiments.
In Mao's time, he often exported revolutions to other countries. Then in Deng Xiaoping and in Xi Jinping's time, the CCP began to infiltrate countries around the world. That's through their unrestricted warfare. One technique they often use is to take advantage of local Chinese organizations, Chinese immigrants or some students' organizations, and use them to achieve the regime's agenda. This has caused some locals to conflate their sentiments against the CCP with the Chinese people. I think this is one root cause of the problem.
Tang also says the CCP is scapegoating others.
They turned the perpetrator that harmed Asian and Chinese Americans into the U.S. government. The argument is the U.S. government's actions against the CCP is to blame for the harm done to the Asian Americans. If you don't fight against the CCP, they won't be harmed.
But Tang argues the Chinese regime is probably doing worse in terms of racial issues. The CCP has kept an estimated 1 million Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps in the Xinjiang region. The regime also cancelled Mongolian language teachings in the Inner Mongolia region. It has led to fierce protests among ethnic Mongol students and parents last year. The regime has also targeted other ethnic and religious minorities, including Tibetans and Falun Gong practitioners.
In its own country, it's not just racial discrimination anymore. It's genocide. It's a serious crime.
Tang says the Chinese regime probably just treats race issues as a leverage. It uses this leverage to shift focus when other countries challenge the regime for its disruptive behavior.
The CCP has always had only one mindset when dealing with the international community, that you have to follow all kinds of rules. But the Chinese Communist Party itself never follows any rules.
He says to avoid such traps, countries should clearly separate the communist regime from the Chinese people. But if they stop pushing back against the CCP for the sake of easing racial tension and then allow the CCP to continue infiltrating their countries, it will probably only lead to more negative sentiment against China among the local population. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
The night before high-level U.S.-China talks in Alaska, the Biden administration subpoenaed a number of Chinese companies. The U.S. Commerce Department made the announcement on Wednesday, saying the subpoenas would probe the companies and look for information about possible national security risks to the U.S. Some have called it a sign that the Trump administration's tough stance on China has partially carried over. The department declined to say which companies were subpoenaed. But as per the Washington Post, a trade lawyer suspects they are the same 5 companies recently labeled threats to U.S. national security by the FCC. That's including Chinese telecom giant Huawei. The subpoenas are part of a Trump-era executive order. It blocks the U.S. from buying communications equipment made overseas that could pose national security risks. Some U.S. senators are trying to cancel Communist China's most favored nation trade status. For more than 20 years, China has held this preferential trade status, and it's widely believed that the status helped China become the world's second largest economy. NTD's Don Ma has more on that.
On Thursday, 3 U.S. senators introduced a bill that will cancel Communist China's Permanent Most Favored Nation, or MFN, trade status. It will require the president to authorize the status on a yearly basis. Senators Tom Cotton, Jim Inhofe, and Rick Scott introduced the China Trade Relations Act. If passed, it will return Beijing to the pre-2001 system. Then President Bill Clinton granted China permanent MFN status in 2000. Supporters argued at the time that the special status would bring more jobs for Americans and encourage democracy and human rights in China.
That China is a one-party state, that it does not tolerate opposition, that it still denies its citizens fundamental rights of free speech and religious expression. What is the most intelligent thing we can do to increase the chances that China will become more open, more democratic, and a constructive member of the global community in the 21st century? I think the answer is to allow them in and to let liberty spread.
But in hindsight, the special trade status did not mitigate human rights issues in China. It did pave the way for China to join the World Trade Organization, or WTO, and boosted business investments in China. China then became the world's second largest economy thanks to the status. In 2016, Trump has said that China's entry to the WTO has led to the greatest job theft in U.S. history. Cotton says, quote, "For 20 years, China has held permanent most favored nation status, which has supercharged the loss of American manufacturing jobs." Meanwhile, Scott says that ending China's permanent trade status is to hold the Chinese Communist Party responsible for its horrific human rights abuses. The bill expands the list of human rights abuses that would disqualify Beijing from the MFN status. It will include concentration camps. That's in light of mass detentions of Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang region. Don Ma, NTD News.
Tufts University in Boston announced Wednesday that it will close its China-funded Confucius Institute. This is the last remaining Confucius Institute in Massachusetts.
Tufts University will shut its Confucius Institute after 6 years. Many were concerned that the Chinese regime-backed institute spread propaganda and restricted academic freedom.
This is not a question of opportunity to study Chinese culture or language. We know that Tufts can find any other Chinese exchange program that isn't directly sponsored by an authoritarian state.
At Tufts, activists have staged a weekly protest outside the institute for the past 13 weeks. They urged the university to terminate the relationship with the Chinese Communist Party.
The Confucius Institute is an arm of the Chinese government, the totalitarian regime that it represents.
The university responded on Wednesday. Their contract with the Confucius Institute expires in September and will not be renewed. That means all Confucius Institutes in Massachusetts will close. According to the National Association of Scholars, 72 Confucius Institutes in the United States have been closed or are in the process of closing, with 44 still active. The Trump administration proposed a rule to make colleges and schools connected to Confucius Institutes disclose their financial ties to them, but it was quietly withdrawn under the Biden administration in January.
Students of one Chinese university were spotted fleeing their campus on Wednesday. That's as the school remains under a pandemic-driven lockdown. Most colleges in China have already lifted lockdown measures, but Guangzhou Vocational and Technical University of Science and Technology in South China isn't one of them. On Wednesday, hundreds of students broke through the sealed campus gate. One student told us that the campus has been subject to the harsh restrictions since last semester. Students aren't allowed to leave without special permission, though professors and staff can come and go freely, something the students have found unfair. On top of that, the university hasn't given its reasons for the extended lockdown, even as other schools reopened. Student life inside the facility hasn't been optimum either. Some have complained about constantly rising cafeteria prices, coupled with a ban on all outside food delivery. Some students also reported becoming ill after eating the school's food. Following Wednesday's exodus, the university hired several dozen more guards to contain students. The university has also levied a new ban, blocking students from posting videos about the situation online. More on the pandemic in China. A hospital worker in the northern city of Xi'an is reportedly infected with the CCP virus on Wednesday, a day after the hospital and its surrounding neighborhoods closed down. All residents there have to undergo testing. The patient worked in an isolation area reserved for CCP virus patients. For the past 2 weeks, the person was there mainly to work on virus tests and worked alongside more than 30 medical workers. They all have been put under quarantine. Local media says all the other medical workers tested negative for the virus. But a staff member of the hospital told NTD it is unclear how many patients there are.
As for how many patients there are, I don't know. When is the hospital going to open again? The exact time is unknown. There is no notice. You can check online when it's announced.
Some Chinese internet users are questioning the effectiveness of the vaccines and asking if the virus has mutated. This is because all medical workers in the hospital's isolation area have supposedly been vaccinated earlier this year. A clip of a makeshift Chinese hospital is drawing attention on social media. It was captured in southwest China's Xishuangbanna region. The video shows patients individually shut inside small cabins. They appear sealed inside. Aside from a small window, patients are seen poking their heads out of as workers deliver food. The person who posted the clip said the hospital patients have all tested positive for the CCP virus and have to quarantine there for 3 weeks. Staying there reportedly costs about $50 a day, and extra fees for medicine and healthcare inspections are charged separately. It is unclear when the video was shot. The person who posted it also noted that Chinese authorities seem to be making good money off of ill patients. Xishuangbanna is an autonomous region in the far south of Yunnan province. It borders Burma, also known as Myanmar, and Laos. The area is known as the home of Dai people, an ethnic minority. Canadian citizen Michael Spavor went on trial in Communist China over espionage charges today. He was detained along with a fellow Canadian and former diplomat more than 2 years ago. It's seen as part of a wider spat between Beijing, the U.S., and Canada.
A Chinese court held its first trial of a Canadian citizen charged with espionage on Friday, but it was the timing that raised a few eyebrows. The trial of businessman Michael Spavor was held in Dandong, across the border from North Korea, where he regularly went for work. Spavor was one of what the Canadian press has called the two Michaels. Both are Canadians arrested by Beijing more than 2 years ago. That happened not long after police in Vancouver detained Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Chinese telecoms giant Huawei, on a U.S. warrant. Beijing has denied that the arrests of the two Canadians were in retaliation. Canadian officials said they were denied access to Friday's trial on national security grounds. Jim Nicol, the deputy head of the Canadian embassy in Beijing, expressed his disappointment.
There is an obligation on the Chinese authorities' part to admit consular officials to attend hearings of our citizens. So we are disappointed in the lack of access and the lack of transparency.
Hours after the trial ended, Beijing said it would set a later date for a verdict. China has a conviction rate of over 99%. Meng Wanzhou remains on house arrest in Vancouver as she fights extradition to the United States. While Beijing has denied a link, Spavor's trial coincides with the first ever talks between Beijing and Washington since President Joe Biden took office. A former Canadian ambassador said Beijing has its eye on Meng's release. Some observers have said convictions of both men could facilitate a diplomatic agreement in which the pair are released and sent back to Canada. The other arrested Canadian, former diplomat Michael Kovrig, is set to appear in court on Monday.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says the trials have no transparency and are disappointing. He adds, quote, China needs to understand that it is not just about two Canadians. It is about the respect for the rule of law and relationships with a broad range of Western countries that is at play. Victims of Communist China held a protest in Washington, D.C. Wednesday, calling to boycott the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. It happened ahead of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's first meeting with Chinese diplomats.
A group of victims representing Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kong, and Chinese democracy advocates launched a campaign in front of the White House on Wednesday. They hope to pressure President Joe Biden and State Secretary Antony Blinken to boycott the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics because of the Chinese Communist Party's massive human rights violations.
I can't describe what I've been through. I was beaten, I was tortured, I was raped for multiple times, gang rapes.
Beijing is the first city to win the right to host both a summer and winter Olympics. Victims who fled communist China's detention centers find it unacceptable. The regime's appalling human rights record has lasted for decades.
It's almost unimaginable that the Olympic Committee decided to host the 2022 Winter Olympics in China, given that the human rights and conditions inside Tibet are terrible.
The protest happened in Washington, D.C., one day ahead of the Biden administration's first meeting with the Chinese diplomats. Beijing's human rights abuses is expected to be one of their major topics.
Withdrawing from the Olympics is a major statement to be making. The actions committed by the Chinese government could no longer be ignored.
In the face of growing criticism, the International Olympic Committee says it does not have the influence to solve political issues in China. It does, however, hold observer status at the United Nations. Reporting by Lin Lin, NTD News.
China's top diplomat is unloading more criticism onto the U.S. His comments came during a meeting between U.S. and Chinese officials in Alaska. There, he claimed that while the U.S. has its style of democracy, China also has its style of democracy, adding that, quote, it's not just up to the American people, but also the people of the world to evaluate how the United States has done in advancing its own democracy. But Yang's logic seems to contradict statements from the Chinese diplomat who sat next to him. That diplomat is Wang Yi, who said earlier this month that it's up to the Chinese people to judge whether China is doing well. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you next time.